She's been stealing from this family. Check her bag. I want someone to check her bag right now." My mother's voice cut through 80 people like a fire alarm. The jazz quartet stopped mid-measure. Glasses froze mid-air, and my fiancée, standing in the center of my parents' living room in the blue dress she'd bought specifically for this night, slowly turned to look at me with an expression I still can't fully describe. Not fear, not anger, something closer to the look you give someone when you've just understood something you can never ununderstand. My name is Arlo, and that night, I stopped being my mother's son. 3 hours earlier, everything had been fine, or it had looked fine, which, in my family, was always close enough. Thea and I had driven up to my parents' estate in Connecticut for the engagement party my mother had insisted on throwing. I want to be clear about that word, insisted. When I called to tell her we were engaged, her first response wasn't congratulations. It was, "We should host the party here. The optics will be better." I should have heard that word, optics, and turned the car around right then. I didn't. Thea had been quiet the whole drive up. I watched her adjust her earrings twice at a rest stop. She looked out at the trees going from green to gold and didn't say much, and I put my hand over hers and told her we wouldn't stay longer than 2 hours. "Promise?" she said. "Promise," I said. We didn't make it 2 hours. I need to give you the background on Thea, because what my mother did to her only makes sense if you understand who she is. She grew up in a small town in eastern Ohio, youngest of 4 kids, parents who spent their careers in public school administration. She put herself through nursing school with 2 part-time jobs and a scholarship she applied for 17 times before she got it. She is, without any exaggeration, the most precise and quietly determined person I've ever met. She does not take shortcuts. She does not manufacture drama. She had never, in the 2 years we'd been together, so much as borrowed money for a parking meter, without paying it back the same day. My family had a different word for her, beneath us, not spoken out loud. My mother was too practiced for that. She communicated it through pauses, a slight hesitation before answering when I mentioned Thea's name. A question about her background, framed as curiosity but structured like an audit. A comment at Thanksgiving about how refreshing it was that Thea had found her path in nursing, as though it were a hobby she'd stumbled into rather than a career she'd fought for. My sister was less polished about it. She'd told me flat out, the summer before, that Thea wasn't the right fit for where the family was headed. I asked her what that meant. She smiled and said I knew exactly what it meant. I did. I just didn't believe they'd actually do anything about it. So there we were at the party. 70, maybe 80 guests. The living room opened onto the back terrace, white lights strung over the garden. People my mother had been cultivating for 20 years. Board members, a city councilwoman, a couple who chaired the same charity foundation she'd sat on for a decade, the kind of crowd you perform in front of rather than talk to. Thea was doing beautifully, which, looking back, probably made things worse. She'd spent 30 minutes talking to my father's oldest friend about the history of jazz, and he'd loved it. She'd quietly helped a catering staff member carry a tray when another one dropped something near the kitchen, stepped in without being asked, set it down, walked back into the party without mentioning it. That was Thea. She didn't make a production of being good at things. I'd gone inside to find 2 glasses of water. That was the window my mother had been waiting for. I came back to the doorway and heard her voice shift into the register she used when she was saying something she'd rehearsed. She was standing 10 feet from Thea, holding her phone out like a piece of court evidence. Chin lifted, speaking to the room as much as to anyone in it. "I hate to do this tonight," she said, which was her way of announcing that she had been planning to do this tonight specifically. "But I have a responsibility to everyone in this home." She looked at Thea directly. "Some pieces from the East hallway display case went missing earlier this week, and this afternoon, we found something in the coat closet." She turned her phone to show a photograph to the guests nearest her. People craned their necks. I pushed through the crowd. "What are you doing?" I said. "Arlo." She lowered her voice in that way that was somehow more frightening than shouting. I'm sorry, but I've had this confirmed. There's a piece from my grandmother's collection that was found near the coat closet. The one Thea's coat was hanging over. The clasp was broken, like it was moved in a hurry. Thea hadn't moved. She was looking at my mother with the stillness she probably used in the ER when something was going very wrong, and panic would only make it worse. I didn't touch anything, she said, quietly, directly. I'm sure that's what you believe, my mother said. That sentence, I'm sure that's what you believe, as though Thea was confused about her own hands. Two guests were already reaching for their phones. I noticed my sister standing near the fireplace, arms folded, and she wasn't watching my mother. She was watching Thea, studying her. She wasn't surprised at all. The police arrived, 11 minutes later. I know because I counted them. My mother had called them before the party started. I found that out later. She'd called that afternoon, told them there'd been a theft at the property, gave the address, and said she'd contact them when she needed them. The officers who came through the front door didn't look confused. They looked like they'd been briefed. I stepped in front of them. This is a misunderstanding. This is my fiancée. She didn't take anything from this house. Sir, please step back, one of them said, flat and practiced. They spoke to Thea. They asked her to come to the station for questioning. Voluntary, they said. But the word didn't carry much weight when two uniformed officers were standing between her and the door. She looked at me once before she walked out with them. She didn't ask me to fix it. She didn't plead with anyone. She walked out with her head level, and I stood in my parents' living room while 80 people stared at me, and my mother set down her phone, and my father said nothing. Not a single word in her defense. And my sister finally looked away from the front door. I drove to the police station. I didn't chase the car. I didn't make a scene. I walked to my own car and drove calmly, and sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room for 3 hours, while Thea was questioned in a room I couldn't enter. And in those 3 hours, I did not panic, and I did not cry, and I did not call anyone from my family asking them to fix it. I sat very still, and I thought about everything I knew, about how my mother operated. She was methodical. She documented things. She planned contingencies. She had not called the police on a gut feeling. She'd arranged for something to look like evidence, which meant she'd moved pieces into position over time, which meant there was a trail. My college roommate Penn had gone to law school and now ran a civil litigation practice in the city. We'd stayed close. He was one of those people who got sharper the angrier he was. I called him from that plastic chair at 9:47 p.m. and told him what had happened. There was a 2-second pause on his end. Don't talk to anyone else tonight, he said. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He walked through the door in 36. Thea was released just after midnight. No charges filed. The piece of jewelry, a small brooch from my mother's collection, had been found in the pocket of Thea's coat, which had been hanging in the closet with 15 other coats belonging to various guests. The officers noted in their own report that there were no fingerprints on the brooch, except those of my mother's housekeeper. Thea had answered every question directly and asked twice whether she could have her coat back. Outside the station, she stood in the November cold without it and looked at me. She called them before the party, Thea said. It wasn't a question. I think so, I said. Okay, she said. And then she went somewhere internal, not shut down, more like she was sorting. Penn drove us to his apartment. We sat at his kitchen table until 3 in the morning. I gave him the login credentials for my parents' estate security system. I still had them from a summer. My father had asked me to monitor the property while they were abroad. I gave him my email history, with my mother going back 18 months. I gave him my sister's number and told him about the comment she'd made that summer, about Thea not being the right fit. Penn didn't sleep. By morning he had pulled footage from 3 cameras. One of them covered the east hallway outside the coat closet. At 2:14 in the afternoon, 6 hours before the party started, my mother's housekeeper walked in carrying a small cloth. She was inside the closet for 47 seconds. She walked back out with her hands empty. Pen rewound it. We watched it a second time. She planted it, I said. He nodded. And I'd bet your mother handed her that cloth. He checked another camera. The kitchen entrance, 1:30 p.m. My mother and the housekeeper in the doorway. 9 minutes of conversation. 9 minutes is a long time to talk in a doorway about nothing. Then Pen found something else. A text my sister had sent to my number by mistake 4 months earlier, meant for someone else. I'd seen it at the time, assumed it was about a charity auction my mother was planning, and moved on. Reading it now, in Pen's kitchen at 4 a.m., the words meant something completely different. She'd asked whether they should handle it before the party, or wait until the night itself, when more people would be there to see. I sat very still for a moment. Your sister was in on this from the start, Pen said. I thought about her face, in the glow of the fireplace, the angle she was standing. The way she'd been watching Thea, not my mother, when the officers walked in. She hadn't been surprised. She'd been watching to see if it worked. Pen filed an emergency motion to preserve the security footage before the system could be wiped. He filed a formal complaint, with the department attaching the footage and the text. He was not loud about any of it. He was exact. The detective on the original complaint called us back, within 4 hours of the filing. By the end of the week, the department had opened a preliminary inquiry into whether the initial report had been filed in bad faith. My mother's attorney reached out 2 days after that. He called Pen's office and offered, on her behalf, a quiet resolution. She would cover any legal costs Thea had incurred, no formal statement. The complaint would be dropped, and the footage would remain private. Pen told him he'd pass it along. He hung up. He did not pass it along. We both agreed the offer had come, because they'd seen the footage and understood what it showed. I went to see my mother myself, without calling ahead. I used my key, walked through the house, and found her in the back sitting room, with her reading glasses on, working through correspondence. She looked up, and her expression did something complicated. Not guilt, more like the recalibration of someone who'd expected a problem to arrive from one direction, and found it coming from another. Arlo, she said, in the tone designed to make me feel like I'd interrupted something. I didn't sit. I set a folder on the ottoman in front of her. Inside, printed stills from the security footage, the text from my sister, Pen's firm's letterhead on a cover page, outlining the civil filing for malicious prosecution and defamation. She looked at the folder. Then she looked at me. This will make things very difficult, she said. I noticed she didn't say, where did you get this, or that's not what it looks like. She went straight to consequences. Yes, I said, for you. She set her reading glasses down. What do you want, Arlo? Be specific. A public statement clearing Thea's name. Filed this week. Your housekeeper is not made to take the fall for this. And the department inquiry runs its course, without any interference from your side. She exhaled, almost a laugh. And if I decline? Pen submits the footage to the press. The civil suit goes forward. Your charity board gets copied on the filing. I paused. You have a board meeting Tuesday. Something shifted behind her eyes. She was calculating, the way she always calculated, weighing exposure against cost. You'd do this, she said slowly, to your own family. I looked at her for a moment. You had my fiancé questioned at a police station on the night of our engagement party. You planned it months in advance. Your daughter helped you plan it. I paused. I'm following your lead, Mom. She didn't answer. I left before she could. My sister called from the driveway. I watched her name light up on my phone and let it ring. My mother did not release the statement. So Pen filed. What happened over the following weeks moved in 2 speeds simultaneously, fast in the external world and slow inside the house. Thea and I were building from scratch. Pen's filing went through. The security footage became part of the civil record. One of my cousins had been going live on a social media account during the party. She'd captured the aftermath of the accusation, not the moment itself, but it was enough. My mother's posture, the officers at the front door, the room reorganizing itself into watchers and witnesses. 12 minutes of footage that, combined with what Penn released, told a complete story. Two of my mother's closest friends saw it. One stopped calling her. The charity board convened an emergency session and voted 6-2 to request her voluntary resignation, pending the outcome of the civil matter. She didn't resign voluntarily, so they made it formal. My sister's fiancé had been at the party. He saw the text exchange when it entered the public's civil record. He went to their apartment, asked her one question. Did you know this was the plan before that night? And apparently the pause before she answered was long enough to be its own answer. He left that evening and called off the engagement the following morning. I heard about it from my cousin and felt nothing. And then felt bad about feeling nothing. And then decided that was probably a reasonable response to someone who'd watched Thea walk out of a police station and done nothing. My father called me during the second week. He wasn't angry. He was tired and quiet. He said he needed me to think about what I was doing to the family. I told him I'd been thinking about this family for 32 years, and that it had cost my fiancée a night in a police station and a room full of witnesses to an accusation she hadn't earned. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother made a mistake. Not she was wrong. Not I should have stepped in. A mistake. Like she'd miscalculated a tip." I said I understood. That's how he saw it, and I ended the call. The civil case settled in month 3. My mother's attorney negotiated, rather than go to trial. The terms included a written statement acknowledging that the report filed on the night of the engagement party had been inaccurate, and that Thea bore no responsibility for the incident. It was a lawyer's sentence, bloodless and bureaucratic, but it was signed and notarized, and it existed. Thea read it once, folded it, put it in the back of a filing cabinet, and never brought it up again. I mentioned it once, because I needed her to know. I didn't think it was enough. She said, "I know, but I'm done spending energy on people who've already cost me too much of it." That was when I understood she was stronger than all of it. The family, the event, the whole architecture my mother had built, out of perception and leverage. Thea had processed it and set it down before I'd even finished being angry. 2 weeks after the settlement closed, we drove to Sedona. We talked abstractly about a wedding, and then talked more honestly about what kind of wedding we actually wanted. And once we pulled on that thread, everything fell away pretty quickly, until we were left with the only version that felt true. Us, a drive to Arizona, a civil officiant, at sunrise on a trail, 2 witnesses, who were strangers. The morning we met them and friends by the afternoon. The air was cold, her hands were warm, she cried for about 40 seconds, and laughed at herself for crying. I cried more than she did, and she has brought it up at least a dozen times since. We stayed 4 days, hiked in the mornings, sat outside in the evenings, ate at places we found by walking until something looked right. No phones after noon, no updates to track, just 4 days of being 2 people who had chosen each other without asking permission from anyone, which is the most straightforward thing in the world. And feels radical when you've spent your whole life in a family that made everything conditional. My mother sent a card to our apartment when we returned. One side of a note card, handwritten. She was sorry for how things had unfolded and hoped we could find our way back to each other with time. I read it twice. I put it in the same folder as the settlement. I'm not going to pretend I've made any permanent decision about her. I don't think that's a decision you make once. What I know is that the relationship we had before that party doesn't exist anymore, and I'm not interested in performing a version of it for the sake of appearances. Penn texted when he saw the photos we sent from the trail. One line, "Good. Now stop working so hard at being the bigger person, and just be the person." I kept that text. Thea is the person I was always going to marry. I knew it early, the way you know things before you can prove them. What I didn't know was that getting there would cost 3 months of litigation, a charity board vote, one broken engagement that wasn't mine, and the quiet unraveling of a family I'd spent 32 years trying to earn a place in. Here is what I've understood since then. Worthiness was never the issue. Control was the issue. The moment I brought someone home, they couldn't file into a category they approved of. The system required her removal. It had nothing to do with a brooch in a coat pocket. It had everything to do with a woman my mother couldn't manage. Someone too composed to crack, too documented to discredit, too loved by me to isolate. She misjudged two things. She misjudged Thea, who was never going to collapse under pressure she hadn't earned. And she misjudged me, who had spent long enough watching how power operated in that house, to know exactly where to look when it was turned against someone I loved. What I did wasn't revenge. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. This was simpler than that. This was evidence. This was making sure a structure built on a lie couldn't keep standing once someone looked at what it was standing on. They built it. I just showed people the foundation.